Welcome to the urinary system with M.Hook. So kidneys are the main portion of our urinary system and they perform most of its functions. They are very important for homeostasis. Basically, what we remove in urine versus what we keep in our bodies helps determine the proper levels for lots of different types of molecules. So different blood solutes like sodium and potassium, blood pH, hydrogen ions. If it's too acidic, we could get rid of hydrogen ions. If it's too basic, get rid of bicarbonate. Also, it helps regulate our blood volume and therefore pressure, as well as the other volumes of fluid within our body. It also helps us remove wastes. The kidneys also secrete hormones, making them part of our endocrine system. One thing they can help with is the regulation of blood pressure. So when our blood pressure is low, they'll secrete renin. We'll have cells that have crystals or granules there of renin. And that will go through the renin, angiotensin, aldosterone steps to become aldosterone and have us keep more sodium, which makes us keep more water and brings our blood pressure back up. Erythropoietin, EPO, helps regulate red blood cell production. So whenever the kidneys detect low oxygen levels, for example, if we aren't carrying enough oxygen due to low red blood cell levels or low hemoglobin levels, they'll secrete EPO, and that'll go into our red bone marrow, like in this figure. And the red bone marrow, those cells will differentiate and make new red blood cells. And last, we use calcitrol to activate vitamin D. That'll help us absorb calcium. And we'd want to do that if we were hypocalcemic, we had low calcium levels. Okay. So urinary system organs. Major organ where we're filtering blood and making urine is our kidneys. And then from there on out, we're transporting urine and we're muscular storage area and muscular tube out. So we've got our ureters from the kidneys to our bladder, and from our bladder to the urethra when we expel urine. Okay. So looking at the anatomy here, we've got our kidneys. The right kidney is lower slightly than the left kidney. That's because we've got the liver taking up space above it. Sitting superior on top of the kidney, so you've got your adrenal glands secreting epinephrine, norepinephrine. And then we've got the renal arteries and veins leading in and out of the kidneys, as well as the ureters heading down to the bladder and the urethra out. So our bladder is going to sit anteriorly right behind that pubic symphysis. Okay. So kidney anatomy, as we discussed slightly, they're retroperitoneal. So remember, the peritoneum is the serous membrane around your abdominal pelvic cavity. And that's that 2 layers with fluid in the middle. Kidneys are behind that, so they're retroperitoneal. So that's not going to be surrounding them on the outside. And they're in your lower back area. They go from your last thoracic vertebrae through your 5th lumbar. Right, but slightly lower, and the adrenal glands sit on top. Cool. Here you can see this transverse section. We've got the posterior portion there. Here are your kidneys. They're in the back, behind the serous membrane. They've got lots of fat around there to help cushion them. So where everything enters and exits, just like at the lungs, is called the hilum. And there you've got your renal artery supplying oxygenated blood, the renal vein sending out filtered deoxygenated blood. We've got nerves and lymphatics going in here, as well as the ureter exiting. Okay. So external layers, we've got connective tissue. We've got a couple membranous layers as well as a fat capsule. On the outside, you've got the renal fascia. That's going to help anchor the kidneys down. And then you've got the adipose capsule, or sometimes called the perirenal fat capsule. That's going to be the fat layer that helps cushion and keep things in place. And then the internal layer is the same as the outside of the ureters. It's your renal capsule. So that provides this nice layer where we've got those tight junctions, and it helps keep everything within the kidney separate from everything outside. Now, it's not in the abdominal cavity proper. It's not intraperitoneal, it's retroperitoneal. So we don't have to worry too much about infection spreading, but this is a nice layer to maintain that nice barrier. Cool. Now let's draw some of the internal renal anatomy. So the outer part of our kidney is called the cortex. So we've got our kidney, and I'm trying to make it fairly kidney shaped with the hilum here, that indentation where we've got ureter exiting, we've got renal arteries and veins coming in and out. Outer portion is called the cortex. So just like our lymph nodes, we've got a cortex, the outside, and the medulla in the middle. And we've got pieces of the cortex coming more into the middle, called the renal columns. Okay, so there's our cortex and our columns. Then the medulla is the middle portion, and we've got these triangular shaped renal pyramids. So the cortex is where our urine is filtered from our blood, and then once it's filtered, it's going to move through these pyramids to the tip, to the papillae. And remember, papilla, bud, we saw the papillae in our taste buds, papillary muscles in our heart, right? Good. And those are part of our medulla. And then within here, we've got some structures, some like tubes, that we're going to have our urine move through. So I'll try to show this coming around the papillae. So we've got first our calyces. When you have one tube right outside one papillae, you've got a minor calyx. So here we're drawing a couple minors. And when they come together, like right here, it's called a major. So minor is only one, major is two or more fused together. And then those come together in what's called the renal pelvis. Basically, it's the last stop, and it's continuous with our ureter. So pretty much this region here, and when we look at a dissected view, it'll be much nicer, would be the renal pelvis. We could show the ureter exiting and going down to the bladder. Okay, so here's our cortex. Lots of blood flow here. We filter the blood, make urine. And then we've got the renal pyramid. And these stripes here are actually going to be part of the structure that we'll look at next, called the nephron, where we've made urine, and now we're exiting at the papillae into a minor calyx, major, into the renal pelvis, and that's continuous with our ureter. And you can see fat inside here as well, helping to stabilize support. So I recommend pausing and going through the route that urine would take from cortex through the pyramid to the papillae, to the minor calyx, major calyx, renal pelvis, ureter, down to the bladder. Here's a dissected view. These look really great. So they've taken out and cleared out this system of tubes where urine goes through. You can see the papillae there. Renal pyramid, renal columns, cortex, much lighter in color, down into the ureter. So we've seen the hilum, and we've seen where blood and nerves come in and exit the kidney at. When you're in your parasympathetic rest and digest mode, you're getting between a fourth and a fifth of your blood flow total out of your aorta into the kidneys. So you're getting a huge amount of blood flow there. And you'll see that right before those vessels, right before the renal artery enters the kidney, it splits off, and then those will move, and most of the capillaries will be right in that cortex. And then venous flow, same idea, cortex, branch to the renal vein. So you can see that flow there and how they branch. And these are going to be where our nephrons are, where we're doing the filtering at. So the nephron is our structural functional unit of urine formation. So remember, a functional unit is basically the smallest piece you can break everything down into and still have all the important parts. And each of your kidneys has over 1 million. There are 2 parts here, the renal corpuscle, where we actually are filtering the blood, and then the renal tubule. So once we've pushed fluid out of our blood, it's going to move through this tube system. And we're going to decide what from that filtrate we've made we want to keep in our body and what we want to excrete as urine. So renal corpuscle first, you've got blood flowing in and blood flowing out. So what you have here is an arterial going in and an arterial exiting. Because here we're not focused on oxygen exchange, gas exchange at all. It's all about filtering. So we go into this tuft, this capillary, called the glomerulus. It's under a huge pressure. So fluid, anything basically smaller than these little holes, these fenestrations in the capillary wall, can be pushed out into the space and into the tubule system. So leading in, we've got the afferent arterial. Remember, afferent in nervous system was going in. And then exiting, you've got the efferent going out. And they drew this where the afferent is much bigger than the efferent. That's on purpose. So when you have lots of blood going in and there's a small path out, that's going to put lots of pressure here. And so you've got your glomerulus. You've got what are called podocytes on the outside. Podocytes means foot cells. And so what those do is their little feet can either cover up or leave open those holes on the capillary wall to help us control how fast we're filtering the blood, how much filtrate we're making. And then the capsule outside the glomerulus is the glomerular capsule, or sometimes it's called the Bowman's capsule. So right now, we're just making filtrate. We'll look at the pressures that are important here more a little bit later. So these fluids, anything small enough to fit through, is going to go into the tubule system. So the 2 parts of the renal corpuscle we just looked at, the glomerulus, those capillaries, they're highly porous, they've got those fenestrations. Fluid, solutes move out into the capsule. It's called filtrate. The glomerular capsule is that hollow structure around the outside, catching any fluid and solutes that are pushed out of our blood. Okay. So here's the filtration membrane. We've got those holes, those are the fenestrations right there. Then you've got the capillary wall, and those are the podocytes on the outside with their little feet extensions that can either cover or open up those holes. So this is our nephron here. We just talked about the first portion right here. There's the glomerulus inside of the glomerular capsule. We've pushed fluid and solutes out of the blood into the tube system, and now it's called filtrate. So we went from renal corpuscle. Now we're going to look at the tubule system, that the filtrate that will become urine goes through. So there are 3 parts of the renal tubule. The paroxysmal convoluted tubule. So if somebody tells you a convoluted story, it's not very straightforward. It's got lots of twists and turns, right? So convoluted turns a lot. Proximal means it's proximal to the renal corpuscle. So if I had to draw just an example, there's our tube system that's weaving around. There's our PCT, proximal convoluted tubule. And then we're in the cortex for this part. Then we dip down into the medulla through our nephron loop. And we have some nephron loops that are fairly short and some that are fairly long to help increase the concentration of our urine. So going down, we have the descending limb. And going back up, we have the ascending limb. Now, I've drawn this in a straight line, but really, the ascending limb is going to come up by our corpuscle. And then last, we've got the distal convoluted tubule, and based on its name, you should already be able to have an idea of what that looks like. So we've got convoluted again, and then this is going to go into our collecting ducts. So all the nephrons are going to drop off their fluids, which by this point is basically urine. The only thing we could reabsorb really would be mostly water. Good. So proximal convoluted tubule, it's in the cortex. It helps us with reabsorption and secretion. So we'll get more in depth on each of these ideas. But basically, so reabsorption. We absorb nutrients in our digestive tract, right? We absorb them from the food we eat into our blood flow. So reabsorption would be bringing them back into our blood flow again. Sorry. So we keep them in our body. We reabsorb them back into the blood. Whereas secretion would be pushing waste from our blood into that tube system. So metabolic nitrogenous waste that we want to get rid of, we can secrete, push into the tube system, lose it as urine. Then we've got the nephron loop. And last, the distal convoluted tubule. And so by this point, we've hopefully reabsorbed everything we wanted to keep, mostly. So it's going to be more about secreting waste that we want to get rid of. And then that distal convoluted tubule from each nephron is going to dump into a collecting duct. So one collecting duct will take urine from several different distal convoluted tubules. And these run through those renal pyramids, and that's what make it look a little bit stripy. And then by the end of that, we've got urine. It goes from the papillae into the calyces. It's done being altered at all. Cool. So here's our nephron. We've got our renal corpuscle with the glomerulus and the glomerular capsule. And then we go into our renal tubule. Paroxysmal convoluted tubule. And then we've got the nephron loop, the descending limb, going down into the medulla, down into that pyramid. And we've got the ascending limb come back up to the distal convoluted tubule. And there's our collecting duct that it's emptying into. And you can see several nephrons going into that one collecting duct. So most of our nephrons are going to be the cortical nephrons. That's what we just looked at in the last picture here, where the loop goes down in the medulla, but it's not terribly long. Whereas juxtamedullary nephrons have much longer loops. So juxta next to medulla. So they go far in, and what that allows us to do is to reabsorb more water. If we reabsorb more water, we keep it in our body, which means we don't lose it in our urine, which means our urine has less water, and so it's more concentrated. There's more solutes compared to less water. So the kangaroo rat is an awesome creature. It lives in the southwest US, and it has all long nephron loops. And what that means is that from what it eats and its metabolic water made during cellular respiration, it doesn't need to drink water. It produces enough on its own, and it loses so little that it stays hydrated properly. Lots of different animals will have different nitrogenous wastes, so like birds and reptiles have very concentrated waste so that they don't lose water either as quickly as we do. So there's the cortical nephron. So we see our whole cortex and then that renal pyramid. And that nephron loop goes about a third of the way in this picture. Whereas the juxtamedullary goes almost all the way down. It's super long, so we have more time to reabsorb more water. Then you can see how the collecting duct empties down into that papillae. Our kidneys have an interesting capillary setup. They actually have two sets. So unlike our other vessels where it's artery, capillary vein, arterial, capillary venule, we have the glomerulus where we saw an afferent and efferent arteriole. where we're just about filtration and pressure. And then we have a second set of capillaries where we have our gas exchange, where we're reabsorbing the nutrients we want to keep and secreting the nutrients or the waste that we want to get rid of. In those longer nephrons, the nephron loop has what's called the vasa recta, this net-like structure that you can see here to help take in more of that water, help us reabsorb more. Okay. We talked about the glomerulus is for filtration, and that we had an afferent arterial and an efferent afterwards, and how efferent, the blood exiting, the efferent arterial is smaller, which means that the glomerulus is under high pressure. Think about we're in our big highway where we've got 10 lanes, we go down to 2. There's going to be a lot of pressure here, forcing fluids and solutes through those holes if they fit. Good. And then we'll see that efferent arterial wrap around the tubules. So around that proximal convoluted tubule, for example. That's our peritubular capillaries around the tubules. So these are where we have that gas exchange occurring, where we have the reabsorption of solutes and water, and the secretion of wastes. So if we look back at this picture, glomerulus, peritubular capillaries, wraps all the way around so we can make sure we reabsorb those nutrients. And then we've got the vasa recta. Vasa recta, that long net-like structure that goes down the nephron loop. And our juxtamedullary nephrons, where we're making that concentrated urine, keeping more water in our body, so our urine would look more yellow. Good. Peritubular capillaries, vasa recta. Good. The last part of the nephron we're going to talk about is the juxtaglomerular complex, the JGC. So this is kind of a regulatory area of the nephron. It's our afferent arterial, its cells in between, and then its cells of our ascending limb of the nephron loop. So if we look back at this picture, we can see that the nephron loop actually comes back up right by the glomerulus. So it's folded up. So we've got that nephron loop coming up, and we've got cells there. So they're going to help us regulate our filtrate, regulate blood pressure as well. So the 3 cells we have there, we've got the macula densa of the ascending limb of the nephron loop. So you can see that right here. These cells have chemoreceptors. They can look at our salt levels. In our arterial, we've got the granular cells, and they're called granular because these have these grains on the outside with renin. When the mechanoreceptors, these receptors that when they get pushed on, when they get stretched, they send signals. They can tell about pressure. And so when our pressure is too low, they would secrete renin, would help us bring it back up. And then between the two, you have what are called mesangial cells. So they don't know exactly what those do. There's the mesangial cells in between. And they think that they send signals because they have gap junctions, those channels between membranes, just like our cardiac muscle tissue. They think that they help send signals between the two areas, but they're not really sure. Lovely. So there's the macula densa of our ascending limb, the mesangial cells in between, and the granular cells of that afferent arterial, the bigger one, coming in. Good. So join us in the next lecture video where we talk about kidney physiology.